to your friends, how are you different from anyone else? Even pagans do that.
Even the pagans do that. Thank you, Timmy. What is something that we said yesterday in class about these verses? Yeah, this is my kind of feeler. I'm trying to get an idea of how much we talked about yesterday. Sorry, my back is kind of hurting me. What is something that we said about this yesterday? Anything at all? Timmy?
He gives sunlight and rain to everyone, not just Israelites.
Right. Here's a very interesting point. It's interesting because we take it for granted. We don't even think twice about it. The sun comes up, it rains. Yeah, so what? What else is new? The idea is in the Bible describes sunlight and rain as gifts, as like blessings from God. And if you unpack the ideas there, what he's saying in part is that there's nothing that God will command you to do that he himself is not doing. So he's commanding us to love our enemies, to be good and pray for those who are not good and kind to us. Right? God's doing that already. How so? He provides sunlight to all people, whether they like him, love him, or don't. He provides rain to those who worship him and those who reject him. So it's interesting to me that the sunlight and the rain are two things that are mentioned as specific acts of love. And my question to you is, how is sunlight and how is rain an act of love? And we did talk about this yesterday. How is sunlight or rain an act of love? How is that God showing love to those who don't really care about him? Ava?
We would die without loving him.
Ultimately, you could simplify it with that statement, you would die without sunlight. So said another way, God is giving life on a daily basis to those who want nothing to do with him. And it speaks to a couple different things. One is, you do realize that God is the creator. He could take your life as easily as he creates it. He can take your life at any moment. Now, he usually doesn't do this. But the point is that he has the power to do it. He has the capability of essentially snapping his fingers and removing the life from you. In other words, that you aren't, the fact that you're still breathing right now and living right now, and in some cases, maybe many cases, thriving, like you have food, you have clothing, you have friendships, you have the school, you have your parents, you have a church, you have talent, the list goes on and on. The fact that all these things we take for granted, the fact of the matter is, though, that God, these are all gifts. Like, these are all acts of love, and he gives the sunlight and he gives the rain to both those who love him and those who don't. So God is already doing this. He's already loving his enemies in a sense. He's being good, kind, helpful, beneficial to those who want nothing to do with him. Those who curse his name, those who reject him completely, those who want nothing to do with, those who are living in open rebellion against him, he's still giving his sunlight to them. In essence, life. Again, that is the gift, is it not? That's the main gift that all of us have, that all of us take for granted, is life itself. Okay? So God will never call you to do something that he himself is not doing. That's part of the point here. What else did we say about this yesterday? Anything else? Eva?
That you can be a child of God, but not necessarily acting like it, but by loving your enemies, you will be acting as true children.
Excellent. And then that's the NLT does a better job of pulling that out. That's showing you that, right? That when you choose to be kind to someone who's not kind to you, to not essentially to not steal when they're stealing from you, to not be rude when they're rude to you, right? And instead, actually encourage those who are rude to you. Right? The point is, when you do that, you're acting like the child of God that you are. If you're a Christian, you're a child of God, right? But when you can be a Christian here, you can be a child of God and not act like a child of God. I mean, all of us can relate to that, right? You're a Christian, you do believe, you're all in, but there are times when the way you act is not how God would want you to act. And one of the points here is when you do this, it's actually evidence. You're actually living out what you claim to believe, right? You're acting like the child of God that you are. This is a high standard, guys. There's no way around this. There's no escaping this. Like, you are called to this as a Christian. Obviously, if you're not a Christian here, you're like, I would never do this. This is crazy talk. What the heck is this? I reject this. Obviously, if you're a Christian, if you're not a Christian, you're not going to really take this seriously. But if you're a Christian here, the idea would be that you can't escape this. There's no way around this. Yes, you can ignore it, right? But the point is that you're called to this standard, and it's not easy. In fact, it'd be difficult for anyone to do this. But that's kind of the point. It's difficult, but not impossible. You and I need God's help in this to actually do it. If someone's attacking you verbally, I mean, it's not a secret to think or to say out loud that you'd want to react by doing something back. Whether that means violent or just saying something back to them, right? That's human nature. It's not okay. I'm saying that's human nature. But the point would be here to do something radical, do something different. And all I can say is, if you try this, I'm going to ask you here in a moment if there's any stories that any of you guys want to share about living this out. Okay, I'll share one. But this is not just a nice idea or an interesting concept. If you actually do it, it has a way of, at the very least, waking people up. Like, getting people's attention. Okay, maybe this God thing is real. Like, why would this person do this? That's not normal behavior, right? There must be something real there. What is it? Right? At the very least, acting this out, living this out, sometimes and many times will result in the person who's being rude or sinful getting their attention, waking them up to the realities of God. Okay? One of the things I want to say before we move on to a different topic is there's this statement here that's pretty crazy. Right? It's easy to care and love those people who are loving you, like your best friends. You guys have best friends, you have people that you're close with. I would maybe not say easy to love them because they're still human, but the idea would be, it'd be a lot easier to love someone that you care about that's kind to you than to love someone who's rude to you. But there's something very interesting here. If you only love those who love you, what reward is there for that? What's the implication? What's the implied answer there? If you only love those who love you, what's the implied answer? Ava?
That there's no reward.
Why not? Isn't that a good thing to do, loving those who love you? Why would there be no reward from God? And there's some people who like stop here. Well, I love people. Those who are good to me, I love them, right? God's saying, you don't get any credit for that. That's assumed. It would be, if you're a Christian, it'd be assumed that you're loving towards people who are kind to you. And some people aren't even that. Like, there are some people I know who, like, their parents are, like, super nice, super kind, and they're jerks to them. Like, they're receiving love and care and concern, and yet they don't even love those people. Like, that's worse. That's worse than a sinner here. Even the sinners do that. The specific word that's used, we said this yesterday, tax collectors. As a quick review, what are tax collectors in Jesus' day? Scum of the earth. They're the worst sinners. They're literally the worst sinners in that day. And if you don't think tax collectors are the worst sinners, then fill that in with something that you think is legit bad. A murderer, an adulterer, pick a sin that you think, you yourself think is horrible. Lying, cheating, whatever it is for you. Whatever you think is the worst sin, fill it in right here. And what God's saying to you is, even those who are guilty of that serious sin love those who love them. So you're not going to get a reward. You can do that without God's help, essentially what he's saying. You don't need my help for that. Even the sinners who don't ever talk to me, don't ever care about me, don't live for me, even they do that. So there's no credit. Don't think that that's a standard. That's not the standard. The standard is when people are jerks to you and you're kind to them, that's when you're acting like one of my kids. That's when you show what I'm all about, is when you show grace when someone doesn't deserve it. When you show kindness when someone doesn't deserve it. When you are actually helping someone who are hurting you. Someone's hurting you and you are looking for opportunities to help them out or to encourage them or to pray for them. This is radical, guys. This is a radical teaching. It was back then, it is today. And all I can say is if you do this, it has a way of, at the very least, getting people's attention towards God. The standard is high. Okay? This last one, if you are kind only to your friends, actually let me read this in the NIV, I think this is a little bit over here. If you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Don't even pagans do that? If you only greet those, the idea is welcome. Welcome and accept. If you only talk to, welcome, and accept those who look like you, talk like you, think like you, the pagans do that. Those who want nothing to do with God do that. So again, that's assumed behavior. If you're a Christian, it would be assumed that you're kind, welcoming, and nice to those who think like you, talk like you, look like you. So if you're in a sports team, it'd be like your boys on the team, right? There's nothing. It would be assumed that you're kind to them. It'd be assumed that you welcome them and talk to them and are nice to them. The idea would be that you step outside that comfort zone and you talk to someone who doesn't think like you think. You talk to someone, you welcome someone, you love on someone who disagrees with you. Unfortunately, we live in a world where this is becoming more and more rare, where we can no longer disagree, like we just demonize. Well, if someone disagrees with us, we assume that they're crazy. We assume that they're like out of their head, like they're just ridiculous, right? Because they don't agree with you. This is the toxic environment that we all live in, right? We're called to something different, guys. So what Jesus is saying is actively welcome, actively love on, actively care for people who don't think like you, talk like you, act like you. Your own people here. Even the pagans care and welcome and love people that look like them, talk like them, think like them. Even the pagans do that. So you're called to a higher standard. Reach out to the person in the cafeteria who no one else is sitting by. Talk to the person that is not an athlete if you are, right? Or vice versa. If you're not an athlete, talk to the athlete, right? The idea is the cliques. There's comfort in cliques. I get it. I totally understand it. I get it. It's safe zone. It's your buddies. I get it. What we're saying here is Jesus is calling you to step outside that. Yes, love on your friends, your sport, your athletes, the people on your team, your classmates, the people who look like you, talk like you, think like you. Obviously, yeah, love on them, care for them. But the idea is he's challenging you here. Step outside those cliques. Talk to someone from a different clique. Accept them, welcome them, love on them, right? Watch what happens. Powerful. It is. It's rare. It's so rare. But if you do it, it's very, very powerful. It has a way of bringing people together. So what we tend to do is we build up all these walls, all these like barricades, like, oh, you're part of that group over there, so I'm not going to talk to you. Oh, you're a fan of that team over there, so I'm not going to talk to you. Oh, you're a Republican, I'm a Democrat, I'm not going to talk to you. Oh, you're a Baptist, I'm a Pentecostal, I'm not going to associate with you. What? Those are your rules. That's not what he's calling you to do. He's calling you to break the walls down and to welcome and accept and love on all people. Again, this is not easy. But this is what he's saying to do, guys. Any examples of this? Anyone want to share a story of a Christian you know, mom, dad, brother, sister, yourself, someone at the school, someone that you're aware of, you know, who was mistreated, was sinned against, something happened that was not good, and instead of retaliating in the same way, they actually showed kindness, love, mercy. They prayed for that person. Any stories like this in real world? The previous class had a number of people had stories. And anyone want to share one here? Any examples of this in the real world? Someone is unkind, a jerk, offensive, mean, and instead of reacting in the same way, you are loving on them, praying for them, serving them. Any stories like this? Is that a hand? It's not a hand. All right, let me share one. Okay, this is one example, and I'm on the extreme, on the spectrum of like sins. This wasn't like if 10 is like the worst possible sin and 1 is like maybe not any sin at all. This was maybe like a 5, so it's somewhere in the middle. It's not extreme. It's not nothing, but it's a real scenario. Okay, I don't think I shared this last year. If you had me last year, but I may have. True story. In the jail, I'm a chaplain. In the jail, there is what we call the God Pod. And the God Pod was essentially a separate part of the jail where inmates could volunteer themselves to a program. The program was essentially pastors from all over the city. Different denominations, different churches would come to the jail, and they would essentially spend time with the inmates who volunteer themselves to this program. We called it the God Pod. It actually was literally a huge tent. So completely voluntary, you can't force anything in the jail system. But in the God Pod, one of the things we did was we encouraged the inmates to lead devotions every morning. It would give them an opportunity to own what they say they believe, right? So every morning there would be a devotion led by one of the inmates in this God Pod situation. Okay. One particular morning, a guy who was leading to the devotion that morning decides to write basically the lesson on a whiteboard like this. He outlines it, he summarizes it, he has a verse, he has a theme. Obviously spent a lot of time on it, prepared it, spent time thinking about it. He wrote it all out on the whiteboard, okay? And he's prepared. Some dude thinks it's funny to come to the whiteboard and essentially take his sleeve and just wipe it all off. Now, on the grand scheme of things, is that like a serious sin? It's not murder, right? It's not adultery, but it's definitely disrespectful. It's definitely rude. It's definitely inappropriate, right? So you can imagine if you had spent a lot of time on a message and the only way you could deliver it, or one of the only ways, was a whiteboard, and someone comes and just wipes it all off, how you would react to that. This inmate, ultimately, long story short, I get called to the God Pod. They want me to talk to this person one-on-one, and this person, it sounded urgent, so you never know what that means in the jail system. It could mean suicidal. It could mean just they're overreacting to something, like they're separate from their family for the first time. They don't know how to deal with it. There's a whole range of things that in the jail system that you could potentially expose yourself to. So I get this call, come to the God Pod. This guy wants to talk to you ASAP. I get to the God Pod. He explains to me what happened. There's more detail to it. That's the basic situation. He explains what happened with the devotion, and he's like, man, I really want to punch this guy. Like, I really want to physically hurt this guy. And as I'm listening to him describe his feelings and the situation, I'm thinking to myself, what should I tell this guy? And it dawns on me, this verse right here. I said, you want to be truly radical? You want to do something genuinely crazy? Look for opportunities to show kindness to this guy. Look for chances to encourage him, love on him, treat him with love, care, concern, right? True story. And he initially is like, seriously, that's what you want me to do? I said to him, if you take this seriously, this is exactly what Jesus wanted you to do. Treat the unkindness with kindness and watch what happens. Hard, difficult, I totally get it, it's hard, right? But try it out, see what happens. To his credit, he tried it out. And what ends up happening, long story short, is this guy who was completely rude and just kind of a goofball, didn't take it seriously, the inmate, what he did was he actually looked for opportunities to buy this guy meals give this guy food. He would pray for them. He would encourage him. Again, in response to complete disrespect, right? And the guy who initially erased the board was completely shocked, to the point where he came to the faith. Like, he became a Christian, and it wasn't very long before he himself was leading devotions in the God pod, right? The guy's kindness, I'm skipping a bunch of details, but the guy's kindness, the guy living this out, had made such an impact on the other inmate that the other inmate essentially came to the faith. And the other inmate became one of the leaders in the God pod. Goes from complete goofball, not taking it seriously at all, to a genuine faith in God, and then is used by God in the God pod. And I'm just saying, that's just one scenario. But I'm just saying, this stuff, if you actually apply it out, can make differences in the lives of real people. But it's not easy. It's just not. But it's powerful. Okay? Any other stories you want to share? Yeah.
Okay, I don't know the person, but I read this like really cool story in a book. So
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. So there's this book called Everybody Always, and like it's pretty famous.
Mhm.
But the author, he was doing work in Uganda, and he was like starting orphanages and stuff there. And in Uganda, there's like witch doctors who try to kidnap kids, and they like will like cut body parts off to sell or make human sacrifices and stuff. And this one, the author like had this one like 10-year-old boy, I think, who was almost like a son to him, and he did end up adopting him. And that little boy got kidnapped by this one witch doctor and like left for dead basically, and he almost died, but he ended up being like, he's okay now. So the author like really was like challenged to love his enemies. So he actually like he went and talked to the witch doctor that like, because they caught him, and he went and like talked to him and like tried to just like make normal conversation with him as if he wasn't a witch doctor. And he ended up starting like a school for all the witch doctors in the area and teaching them how to read, because most of them, he found out that most of them were that occupation just because they didn't have any other way to make money and stuff. So he started teaching them how to read so that they could get other jobs. And a lot of them became Christians, and they ended up like saving other kids, because they would know when like a new witch doctor came into town, they would know like, oh no, this kid's in trouble, and then they would go and save them. So it ended up they all became Christians, and like the only thing that school teaches them what to read is the Bible. And so yeah, if that did that explain?
Oh yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
did you say the book was called Everybody Always?
Yes.
I think I've heard that book. Thank you. I mean, these are real. These are just two stories here. Any others? Thank you for sharing that. That's beautiful. That's exactly what we're talking about here. It's hard. It's very hard. Okay, but you can put an end to the cycle of sin, because what happens is, you do this to me, I'm going to do it back to you. I'm going to escalate it, make it worse. You did it to me, I'm going to do it back to you. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Just continues and continues. What needs to happen is someone needs to inject or introduce some loving kindness. You can't overcome hate with hate. You overcome hate with love. Easier said than done, I get it. But holy cow, this is powerful. That is a very powerful story. There's many, many stories out there. I highly recommend checking into it if you've never experienced this yourself. This has real effects in the real world if you live it out. Okay, there's a lot more to say about that, but I think we made our point. By the way, I think the last thing I'll say is tonight is the election, right? It'd be really relevant to say this: if you're a Republican in this class, if you live in a household that's staunch Republican or all Republican, guess what you're called to do to those who are Democrats? Pray for them, show them kindness, reach out to them in love. By the way, this is reversed, obviously. If you're a Democrat, if you're living in a Democrat house, you're actually called to serve, help, and love Republicans. What we do in this country usually is the opposite. We demonize. We will say something that's we'll just We'll look for all the negative in the other side. We won't treat them as humans. We'll think of them as less than human sometimes, not every person. But I'm just saying to you, this is really relevant and practical. We live in a world that's a lot of times toxic. Toxic behavior only breeds toxic behavior. The idea would be, as a Republican, you may completely, you guys do realize you can completely disagree with someone and still love them? That shouldn't have to be said, but it's just so rare now that I think it's helpful to hear it. You can completely disagree with someone and actually genuinely care about them, instead of bashing them, calling them crazy, calling them names, treating them like they don't exist. That is typically what happens. This applies to all aspects of life. Other teams, people of different colors, skin color, people of different political parties, people of different denominations. Again, this breaks through all of that if you live it out. Okay? Enough said about that. Let's turn to page 64, 6-4. We're transitioning into a different conversation here. The conversation we're about to have, guys, is about evidence that exists outside the Bible. Evidence that exists outside the Bible that teaches us about the Bible. Yes. Is it an emergency? Kind of? Can you hold it? If it's an emergency, go ahead. If it's not an emergency, just sit there. We don't have that much time left. Page 64. Page 64. And on page 64, we're starting this conversation about what kind of information, what kind of facts, what kind of evidence exists out there, outside the Bible, that can teach us about the Bible. This is an important topic. It's one thing for me to say to you that Jesus views the Old Testament as truth, like, as if you believe in Jesus, obviously that impacts you, right? But in a sense, that's the Bible talking about the Bible. It's like a verse that we studied in the previous weeks. All scriptures God breathed, not some of it, not a little bit of it, all of it. That's the Bible commenting on what the Bible is, right? Here, we're going to put the Bible aside for a second. What exists outside the Bible that would suggest that the Bible should be taken seriously? Super important. Let's start this conversation on page 64. I'll volunteer to read the first paragraph under external evidence on page 64. This is the first paragraph, a person's testimony. Volunteer? This is the top paragraph, first paragraph under external evidence for the Bible's authority. Thank you, Sam.
A person's testimony about him or herself constitutes internal evidence for authority, but the claims of others external to the person can add a different kind of credibility. So far we have examined Jesus' authority based on the words of the Bible itself, but is there any testimony about the Bible's truthfulness from outside sources? If a longtime basketball player said, "My career three-point shot percentage was 65%. We might scoff and doubt. However, if we uncovered an old record book verifying the claim, we might reasonably say, it sounds too good to be true, but I give this player's claim the benefit of the doubt."
Okay. Illustration, sports illustration. If you know anything about basketball, you know that 65% from three-point land is insanely high. So the vast majority of people would not average that high of a percentage. That means you're making 65% of the three-point shots that you take. That's really, really high. If I told you in high school, if I said you, when I played basketball in high school, I shot 65% from three-point land, you might think, oh, okay, Mr. Eastman doesn't really lie, he usually tells us the truth. Whatever you might think of me, I consider him a reliable source. So I might believe him just on what he's saying. But if I then showed you newspaper clippings of multiple games and multiple seasons I played, and sure enough, you see in the newspaper, in the area that I lived, that there's my name, there's my field goal percentage. It actually was 65%. There's external evidence outside myself that shows you what I just said to you. That it's proof, evidence outside myself that what I said is true. Okay, that's not the case. I didn't shoot that well. But I'm just saying as an illustration, you would, if you got external evidence, it would hold weight. You would hold that idea. It might sound crazy, but holy cow, it's right here in print. So it must have actually happened, right? Here's what we have with the Bible, okay, to start this whole thing off. If you're not aware of this, the Bible is confirmed by, among other things, archaeology. Archaeology is what? What's happening with archaeology? We talked about this at the very beginning of last year a little bit. If you were with me last year, Case for Christ, Case for Faith, we had a brief conversation about this a year ago, but it was a year ago. And I'm not sure what you've had before that. But what is archaeology? What are archaeologists, what are they doing? Dinosaurs. Okay, that's an example. What is it? They're digging in the dirt, right? And there are archaeologists who spend their entire life essentially moving the earth around to try and find something that helps them understand ancient times, whether it's dinosaurs, other cultures, in this case, the Bible, okay? And what we're going to see here pretty quickly is that archaeology overwhelmingly supports what the Bible has to say. A volunteer to read the paragraph in the middle of page 64. It starts with Professor Emeritus of Biblical Studies. A volunteer, otherwise I will call on somebody. Don't worry about names, don't worry about specific locations. You can just skip the names if you don't know how to pronounce them. But there are a couple points here in this paragraph that I think are super important. Ava? Thank you.
Professor Emeritus of Biblical Studies Philip R. Davies provided an example of why we should not assume that a biblical source is untrustworthy just because we haven't yet found evidence. A professor at the University of Sheffield in England, Davies wrote the following in a book called In Search of Ancient Israel. There are no literary criteria for believing David to be more historical than Joshua, Joshua more historical than Abraham, and Abraham more historical than Adam. There is no non-literary way of making this judgment either, since none of these characters has left a trace outside the biblical text. But just a year after Davies' book was published, an inscription referring to the house of David was found at the Tel Dan archaeological dig. Such an inscription implies the existence of not only David, but also a kingly dynasty named after him. Israel Finkelstein, professor of archaeology at Tel Aviv University, remarks biblical nihilism collapsed overnight with the discovery of the David inscription. And more recently, archaeologists have discovered what they believe to be a palace or temple of David, providing additional evidence for David as a historical person.
Okay, thank you very much. To summarize what was just read there, the idea is that, if you're not aware of this, there are always people with agendas. Agendas are, they're coming from a certain point of view, they want to prove their point of view, and this exists in science, this exists in mathematics, this exists in religion. There are always people who have an agenda, they have a goal in mind. And when it comes to archaeology and this specific kind of science, it shouldn't surprise you that there are people who want to once and for all prove Christianity false. There's always that person. There's always the atheist. There's always, seems like every generation has at least one figure who's trying to make this claim that the Bible's a bunch of fairy tales. You can't prove it. There's nothing in it that's reliable. It's all made up. You know, man had a role in it, so therefore you can't trust it, all this stuff, right? Here you have someone essentially saying that the historical David, the David the Bible talks about, Abraham, and who was the other person here? Abraham, Adam, and Joshua. He's essentially making the claim that they're just made up characters. There's no evidence outside the Bible that would suggest that they actually lived. And then this is saying, a year after that book came out, a year after he said this in the book, there are discoveries essentially that not only prove David was a real historical person, but his whole line. There's evidence that suggests that his whole everything that you read in the Old Testament about David and his family can be backed up into some of these, they're backed up by some archaeological digs. And what I want to say up front before I get into all these, if you look at page 65, on page 65 you have a number of bullet points. Every single one of these bullet points is a specific archaeological find that is essentially lining up with what the Bible says. So let me say this right up front. I said this last year, but we're going to go a little bit deeper on it this year. Everything that they're finding in the dirt, everything they find in archaeology, okay, everything they're finding lines up with Scripture. And it says this another way. There's a couple ways of saying this. One of the ways is they're not finding anything in the earth that contradicts what the Bible says. You would think that if it's a bunch of fairy tales, if it's all made up, that at some point it'd be pretty easy to find something somewhere that contradicts what the Bible's saying. If it really isn't true, if it's just man-made, it's a bunch of junk, you would think that it'd be at least somewhat easy at some point to find something in the earth that would contradict what the Bible's claiming. And yet what you find is the exact opposite. Now, hear this, not everything in the Bible has been discovered. So, to be honest with you, there's not every story you hear in the Bible, there's not always an archaeological dig that proves it's true, but everything they're finding does align with the Bible, if you're following this. So there's still things to be discovered. They haven't discovered every single person, every single location that's found in the Old Testament or New Testament. There's still things to be uncovered. But what we're saying is everything they are finding lines up with what the Bible claims. And sometimes in crazy detail. Let's look at this list on page 65. First, the paragraph at the very top of page 65. I volunteer to read the first paragraph. At the very top of the page, we have discovered. Anyone? Thank you.
We have discovered an abundance of evidence, both direct and indirect, that sheds light on the historical claims and the context of the Scriptures. As we have examined the evidence and considered the scholarly arguments drawn from it, and as we have compared the Scriptures to other written histories from the ancient Near East, we have found the Bible consistently and substantially affirmed as a credible and reliable source of history.
Thank you, Riley. Guess what? That quote doesn't come from a pastor. That quote doesn't come from a Bible teacher at a Christian school. That quote comes from, if you look at the very bottom of page 64, he's a television correspondent who happens to be a religious writer for an undisclosed publication. This is not a Christian person saying this. At least it's assumed. It doesn't say for sure, but there's no mention of this person being a Christian person. What they're saying is the Bible, archaeological digs have a way of only confirming what the Bible says. If you do a deep dive on this, what you're going to find, we're going to cover some of this stuff here, but if you spend a lot of time on this, what you're going to find is everything they discover is only confirming what the Bible says. And let's give you some examples here. A volunteer to read the first bullet point. Actually, let's read what Dennis Ingolfsland, a professor at Crown College, has to say. And then the first bullet point. This list of bullet points are specific examples of archaeological findings that align with what the Bible claims. And some of this stuff is from way back in the Old Testament. Like thousands. Jesus was roughly 2,000 years ago. The Old Testament's way longer than that in some cases. And so what we're finding in the dirt in some cases are really, really old cities, like old archaeological findings that affirm and confirm what the Old Testament says, in some cases as far back as Genesis. It's pretty crazy, actually. I volunteered to read the first bullet point, actually the first paragraph and then the first bullet point on page 65 here. Riley, yes, thank you.
Dennis Singolfsson, a professor at Crown College, has compiled a lengthy list of archaeological discoveries from each of several centuries before Christ, verifying the accuracy of many of the Bible's claims. These discoveries do not establish the inspiration, what is that?
Inerrancy,
Inerrancy.
without error.
And authority of the Bible, but they do point the reasonableness of belief in Scripture's truthfulness. Here are some examples. Do you want me to read the first one?
Yes, and you don't have to pronounce every single one of these cities if you don't want, but
Okay. 11th century BC. Most of the cities mentioned from Genesis to the book of Joshua have been discovered. Ur, Shechem, I don't know what that is. A lot of names, and that's it.
so these are all, thank you very much. These are all, the names are kind of funky, so when you read these in the Bible itself, you're like, what in the world? These are strange names. I get it, totally understand that. But they're actual historical locations. And this is saying, from Genesis to the book of Joshua, the vast majority of cities that you find in those books have been discovered in some archaeological dig. That's saying to you that every location, every single story was accurately and faithfully recorded. And we're going to talk about the process by which the Bible was formed. But at this point, all we're saying is the archaeological digs only confirm specific details. There's a number of them on here. The second bullet point is some of the building projects of Solomon have been unearthed. At Megiddo and, I don't even know how to say that myself, Gezer, right? Solomon was part of what he did is he built the temple that God ended up living in, right? And there's a lot of things that Solomon built. They're finding in the dirt specific projects that he made. I'm just saying to you, like, we're going to cover this list tomorrow. There's very specific things that they're finding in the dirt that point to the Bible's reliability. This should ultimately build your confidence in that what you read in the Bible is historically accurate. It really is telling you what actually happened.